Helen Franks of Movida Sewing and Design Studios. We're located in Vancouver in the neighborhood of Kitsilano on Broadway. We have been here for just over 10 years. And we teach kids and adults how to sew. A little bit about my background is I was initially a self-taught sewer. My mom had a sewing machine at home that she didn't like. In the old days, the sewing machines were in their own cabinet and they were quite big, and the one that she had didn't match her bedroom furniture, so she hated it. She hated sewing, and so when I asked to use it, then she allowed me to. So I was about 8 or 9 when she let me start to use it, and she showed me bits and bobs about what to do. It was about in grade 7 that I really took over, and I was sewing like all the time. My mom was super, super conservative, and she only would like buy me clothes at the beginning of the school year and then maybe like at Easter or my birthday, and buy me really icky clothes because she would only buy like in this conservative realm that I didn't like. So then I would take the clothes that she would buy me, and as in her words, I would wreck them. So I would cut the sleeves off or hem them or make them cool or spray paint them. So this would have been like 1978, 79. So the punk rock movement was coming. So sort of this, the first of the distressed look was coming in. And so I was doing all these things to distress my clothes. But I was also, one of the other things I really liked is Halloween was my favorite time of year. And that was because you could dress up and do whatever you wanted to do. And so I started to make all my own Halloween costumes that I had done before, but now I was actually making them rather than just like procuring them. And then I started to make Halloween costumes for my friends. And so we were sitting at the sewing machine or hand stitching, sometimes gluing or pinning together and making Halloween costumes. So that was a time that I could really start to express myself outside of like the conservative realm. I think that some of the reasons why I did some of those things is because I had a lot of trouble at school. I was later in life diagnosed with ADHD as well as dyslexia, like in my 50s, but I certainly suffered from those things at elementary school. So I really gravitated to the creative, and I found that when I was doing the creative, then I could be really, really successful, and it was some way for me to stand out. One of the other things is that I was always pretty chubby or heavy, and so when I was going to school and my mom was buying me like all the clothes that all the other kids had, I felt like I couldn't wear them as well as them or in the same way. So I would change them up or make them different so that there couldn't be that comparison anymore. And another thing that I used to bug my mom about was that I went to a school where everyone was pretty wealthy and we weren't. So when they all had the name brands, I would have like the no name brand. And so that would also kill me because I felt like, the other kids had the fancy, and they used to tease me. So then I was like, then I thought, if I change them up or destroy them or change them, make them look different or cooler, then it didn't matter that I had the North Star jeans instead of, I think they were like the 3-star jeans or whatever. So those were my early beginnings of like sewing and making and creating and lots of destruction, I guess. So I continued to sew a lot. I went to take sewing at high school, but I was a pretty cheeky kid and I felt like I suffered no fools. And I got into an argument with my sewing teacher like on the second day of class. And she took me to the office and told the principal that I had some mental illnesses or mental problems or something because I was talking back or something. I know the story, but I don't really want to. Anyways, so I never took any sewing at school ever. So I didn't do any sewing at school. I did it at home. And then what else? I sewed a lot of things. So when I was 19 years old, I met a friend who graduated from design school, and she was willing to help me, and I had another friend, and so to learn how to sew. So we would go over to her house on Friday night, and she was Japanese, so we would make sushi. So she would put the sticky rice on, and then she would teach us how to pattern draft or show us how to draft, how to sew, and we would put an outfit together. And we would make the outfit so that we could wear it to the nightclub that night. So we would have a couple of cocktails, make the sushi, and then sew like maniacs to make the outfit up. And then we would then eat the sushi, put the outfits on, and then go out to the nightclub. So sometimes if the outfit was really simple, we could go to the nightclub we would go over like 6 o'clock. We could get there like 10 or 11, but sometimes just for fun, we were just laughing our heads off as if we were running out the door at 1 o'clock in the morning with our outfits on to try and get there for like last call or just to be seen so that we could wear our outfits. So for me, still that lingers is that I always want this immediacy when I make something. So I'm not really great at like long-term projects. I absolutely can do them. Like I can make a blazer and take 12 weeks to make it, but that's not the way that I like to do it. I like to have the idea today, make the pattern today, make the piece of clothing today, and then have a ta-da moment in the same sort of time period. So that is some of the things when I'm working with the students that I know that we have to teach them to do different skills over like a 12-week period. But I also try and have there be some moments during every class where they're feeling some success, or they're feeling like they're making headway, or that they can have some sort of ta-da moment in that day, so that we're recognizing the progress. Because it is really difficult for me, and so I know for the kids the same thing, is that working on something over 6 or 8 or 10 weeks can be really frustrating, and they have challenges seeing the product. So they can sometimes tend to rush. So we try to incorporate that excitement for what they're making in each one of the classes. When I then went on, I was trying to decide when I had graduated from high school whether or not I wanted to go to fashion design school or whether I wanted to go to art school. And I decided that I would go to art school because fashion design school was more practical, and I thought that I might not ever have an opportunity to go to art school, which was sort of presented to me as sort of like a frivolous pursuit. But I knew, even though I did well in high school, that university was not going to be easy for me, and so I thought I should pursue my creative background. So anyways, I went to art school, and I was there for 2 years, and then I took a gap year in between, and I went off to Europe and did a European tour thing. And then when I came back in the March of that year, so I'm not sure what that is, 1982 or 83, I met up with some other girls from art school, and we decided to start a fashion design company. My business partner that I went into business with had a small company, and she was making scrunchies, and she was like the first person to make scrunchies in Vancouver, and that was like a very brand new thing at that time, like it was like a new invention. But she wanted to expand her business, and so she brought me on, and initially I was making all of the jewelry that was going to complement all of the scrunchies, and then we came up with some fabric accessories and things, and then we moved into making clothes. So we started making clothes, and this is a funny story. So we started making clothes with black cotton lycra spandex. And the reason we had chosen that fabric is it was a brand new invention, in that prior to that, there was only cotton knits. They didn't have any spandex. And so at this time, the very first time they were including spandex in some fabrics. And they had decided to, or the first thing they ventured in was to put it in with cotton for t-shirts. So that's the kind of clothes that we decided to make. We decided to take this brand new fabric, and then what you could do is make skin tight clothes, which is what all teenage girls or young 20-somethings want. They want tight clothes. So just as a reference, prior to that, if we wanted something tight, we used to make these pencil skirts. We make them out of like sweatshirt fabric or t-shirt fabric, and we would sew them up the back, and we want them really, really tight so that we would like wiggle and wobble when we walked. But then they would stretch out or bag out. So then what you would have to do is either wash and dry them to shrink them back up, but usually we would just go back in and increase the seam allowance on the back and just tighten them up. And then you'd wear them out again, and they would stretch out, and then you would sew them back up again. So this invention of the fabric to have spandex in it would allow us not to do that and be able to get a skin tight look. So the very first thing we made was like a mini skirt, and we just made a stretchy mini skirt. At the time, I think the next thing we made was like a biker short. So that was like, I don't know, super trendy or popular at the store to make a biker short. And originally, the girls were wearing biker shorts that were actually made for cycling, and they didn't have spandex in them. They were made out of like bathing suit fabric, which is sort of like slightly different. It wasn't really clothing fabric, so now we were able to make them. And then we made leggings and tank tops and like ballerina tops, anything that was like super tight. And then we were the original upcyclers. We wanted to make these little skirts that had a ruffle on the bottom with matching shorty bolero jackets. And at the time, Spain was having a real revival in their cultural development. And they were out of, I guess, fascist rule, I think it was. And so the kids were being really expressive over in Spain. So over here in Vancouver in Canada, everything was Spanish. So we, at that time, chose the name for the company, which was La Movida, which we got out of a magazine that was talking about the Spanish movement of the young kids in university. It means the movement, but it means to do something new. So they were referring to all of these like crazy club kids and kids that were like dressing wild and crazy as the La Movida kids or kids. So we picked up the name and stole it, I guess, or appropriated it for us. And then our first line of real clothing was out of Spanish inspired fabric. So we would go to secondhand stores and buy curtains that were made out of all the old Spanish fabric. So it was like brocade and sort of gaudy with like black backgrounds and gold and velvet. And we would cut it up and we would make these Spanish style cut on the bias, I guess, ruffle skirts, and then these little short bolero jackets. So they were all inspired by the Spanish movement. And then the scrunchies then developed. They were made out of silk, and they were then turned into scrunchies for your wrists, and we would make long gloves, and we put the scrunchies at the top, and then hair scrunchies, and then we made these little peplum belts that were like 3 inches of elastic, and then we would sew the silk on them. So you would have this little silk peplum belt, and then you would wear that belt over top of the bike shorts or the mini skirt or the tights. And so that was this like foofy look on top of the tights. And we did that. And then we got incredible success. We made these little earrings I made all these earrings that had rosebuds on them, red rosebuds. And one day the three of us said, well, we sold it all to our friends, and then we said, we're just going to go out and see if we can sell it. So the 2 other girls that were helping out with the thing, with the designs and whatnot, I just went down to 2 of the most popular, coolest stores in town. They went to the Block and the Underground and showed the stuff, and then we got an order. And it was a pretty big order, and we just like freaked out. We're like, this is super cool, but we didn't have anywhere to do it. So we ordered in this big bolt of fabric, and we rushed around to all the secondhand stores and bought all the fabric, and then we just started cutting and sewing and cutting and sewing. And it was pretty successful and pretty crazy, and we were doing it on top of the dining room table. And one of my partner's dads was helping us with the scrunchies. We would make like hundreds of them, and then his job was he would get them all sewn inside, and he had a what do you call it, like a chopstick or a stick with like a hook at the end, and he would shove the stick through and then turn the scrunchie out, and he would have like hundreds of them piled up beside him. And that was his only job while he was watching the football game, is to turn these scrunchies in. And then we were making these gathered belts, and the same thing. We would run a gather stitch along them, and then we would send him these long strips, and then his wife would sit there and gather all of the scrunchy skirts and send them back to us so that we could then sew them onto the elastic. So we had lots of help. And yeah, and somebody's boyfriend, the belts had snaps on them, and somebody's boyfriend would come in and hammer all the snaps, because when you got an order of like 50, then that was like 150 snaps on both sides. So you're doing like 300 snaps. It was like crazy. So in the September, that happened in March. In September, I returned to school, and the other girls were in school as well. And so we returned to school and worked that job full or part-time evenings and weekends around getting my degree from Emily Carr. And we got that degree from Emily Carr. We then went on after that to run the company for, I guess, an additional 5 years. And we were making 3 collections a year. We were outsourcing, by the end, outsourcing the sewing to a local factory. We were outsourcing some of the pattern drafting that was more difficult beyond our means, because I was not a professional pattern drafter. So once we were getting into production more, then we hired more professional pattern drafters. And at the end, we even were working with a company we still work with, Gordon's Fabrics. We were able to design our own fabric. So we were able to go out and design a printed fabric for what ended up, funny enough, to be our last collection. But go out and pick the pattern, pick the colors. And the idea was that he would go and have, 6,000 meters of the fabric printed off, and then we would use it, and then whatever we didn't use or couldn't use or didn't sell, then he would sell off a year later into the marketplace. So that turns out to be a bit of a funny story. So what we would do is we would make and manufacture clothes right within season. So similar to, I guess, what Zara does now, but people weren't sort of doing that before, is that when the fashion shows would come out or the shows would come out, of course, they weren't shown on TV. We had to buy these magazines that would come out of Europe, and they were like $80. So it must have been huge expense, big fat magazines, and they would have the pictures of all of the designer runway shows. And so we would go through them and then tag them all the clothes that we want to make. And then we would make up samples, and we would go into the shops and show them the samples. And so we were, similar to the fast fashion now, we're able to produce a line of clothes that were relevant to the fashions that had just come out. So we were able to be really fast on the market. And we had a lot of success that way. So we sold throughout Western Canada. We probably had like 20 or 30 accounts at different times. And I, just so to add in, super shy, hated criticism, never went out to one sales call. If somebody came over to the studio where we were producing, I would hide like in the bathroom or go out. I never participated in any of the sales calls. in the end, that was really hard because when I went to go out on my own and do it after the company broke up, when I tried to do my own thing, nobody knew who I was because I had never built any relationships with them. So even though I had designed and made all the clothes and done anything, I didn't have a relationship with those stores because I was always hiding. And so I had a very difficult time starting my own line. So that would be something back to my future self is don't be so afraid. Participate in the meetings or at least take credit for what you're doing because I lacked credibility when I went back out on my own in later years. So anyways, we did all these great things and we applied for this award. So there was this award that came out called the Matinee Fashion Foundation Award. So back then when cigarettes were allowed, companies were allowed to support businesses, they offered awards to companies. And so you had to apply and it was going to give you a grant or an award towards building your business to the next level. So we won the award, and I think we won like $30,000, which was pretty big money back then, like really big money. But what they needed us to do is they needed us to provide a collection for the following season because they wanted to present it. So I can't remember exactly what, I think they wanted a spring summer. So I believe what we did is that we won the award in the springtime. And what they wanted to do was have a fashion show and present all the collections in September when all the spring fashion shows were going on. So they wanted us to create a collection for the spring for the following year and to present that in September. So that was something that we did not normally do. So what we were doing in our daily life is we were still doing our daily production of what we were doing currently. And at the same time, we put together a collection that basically was going to be shown in September to go to market for the following spring. So simultaneously, and so that was good that we had the money. So simultaneously, we're keeping our current market going, and then we're creating this collection that's going to go out for the Matinee Fashion Foundation. We're going to show it in September, and it's going to go to market in spring. And so we did that, and the collection looked really great. It was really current and contemporary, and it worked. And this is where we used the fabric that we got printed. So we were able to get like custom printed fabric. And then this was the first year that the award was initiated, and the foundation that was putting it on just was running really slowly. And they weren't able to get it together enough to promote the product as much as it was supposed to be. So they gave us like labels and hang tags, and we were published in magazines as the winners, and we were giving all this promotion, but they weren't able to put the fashion show together or the media show together. So it kind of flubbed. And then so what we did is we went and took this collection out to all of our current buyers, and all of our current buyers said, this is not what we do with you. You sell in season, so bring it back to us in season. So we did it, and then we came back to them the following year with this collection that we've been holding on in season. And then it was really funny that buyers were like, well, we already saw this from you in September and said that we didn't really want it from you in September. And now, even though it was like pretty good, it wasn't what they wanted from us. They wanted the current fashion. So the orders were really, really small. And we ended up losing the company. We ended up not being able to sustain because we had put all this money into this collection that the foundation wanted us to do, and we were sort of left holding the bag. So it was really unfortunate. It was like a great thing, and then it was also sort of our demise. The customer that we had felt that we went sort of too mainstream, and that was sort of what the foundation, we had always been like really edgy, and even though we won on our edginess, they didn't really support that sort of look for what they were doing. So anyways, so that was the end of the company, and we split apart, and the girls went and did their other things. But then a local manufacturer here at the time picked up our fabric, and they had about 8 stores in town, and they made their whole spring collection out of our fabric. So even though I didn't sell any of it or have any of it, my fabric was like all over town in all these shops. So it was like heartbreaking and yet sort of ironic, and then I was like trying to validate myself, going, well, at least I picked a beautiful fabric, and hundreds of people wore that fabric, and thousands of garments were made out of it. So I tried to do that, but at the same time, it was a bit heartbreaking to walk past these shops on 4th Avenue or Broadway in the city and see my fabric all made up into somebody else's clothes. So it was a bit heartbreaking. So I decided at that point, of course, I needed another job. So 2 things happened. I needed another job, And I thought, well, I went and applied to a bunch of different companies for a job. And as I said, I had a very difficult time getting another job because I wasn't associated with the company. I didn't have like my face and my name were not integrated into the company enough, even though the La Movida had been featured in like the Vancouver Sun and magazines, and I could show them my portfolio and the work. For some reason, it just wasn't there. The connection wasn't there. And also, there wasn't very many companies in town that were in Vancouver that were manufacturing or designing, and certainly very, very few in sort of the area that I was working in, right? So there was lots of like older ladies style clothes, but there wasn't very much contemporary design going on at the time. So I decided I better go back to design school and get a degree, because that's what they're also asking for. And I thought, okay, well, if I have the portfolio and all this stuff that I've done, then I'll have the degree, then maybe I'll get the job. Because the only job that I was getting offered were like on the floor sewing, right? And I just thought, I've been a fabulous fashion designer for like 8 years and covers of magazines and winning awards, and now you want me to like sew on the floor, right? Like I thought I could like move in and be like the head designer, but nobody was willing to give up their head designer spot. So I ended up going back to school for my fashion degree diploma. I chose to go to VCC at the time, and because I had a lot of knowledge anyway, so I just needed those technical support. So I went and did the program for 2 years and did pretty good at it. It was for me, it was relatively easy. And then at the same time, I needed a part-time job. So I started to work with my stepmother as a mortgage broker assistant. I don't know if this was a good thing or a bad thing, but I thought while I had been running La Movida as a young person, I didn't know anything really about money or finance. And so when the company folded, we had made enough money sort of to support our young selves in our early 20s, but certainly didn't make the kind of money that left us with anything in our pocket after we finished. So I thought, I'll work for my stepmother in banking, and then I'll figure out, well, if that's where the money is, how money works and how to make money and invest and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not sure I did learn, but I took my fashion design degree, and then I went back out to get some jobs, and I realized that you could get paid a lot more in banking than you could in fashion design. And so I took a very weird segue, and I went and became a mortgage broker for TD. And I ended up doing that for 15 years. And so in some ways it was good in that I made some money, and I wanted a house and apartment or a picket fence and all those things. So I made some good money so I could do that. But I hated the job every single minute that I was doing it. And when I had started the job, I had a nose ring and I had pink hair and I had cool clothes and I had all this great wardrobe. And literally they my stepmother said, they hosed me off. I had to go with a regular hair color. I took my nose ring out. She bought me a pinstripe suit and a, what do you call it? Like a raincoat. What are those things called? Like a, I don't know, business raincoat. She bought me a briefcase and I became a banker. And it was so distressing to me at the time that I don't even know if I even sewed anything. I stopped watching anything to do with fashion. I had collected from the time I was 13 Vogue magazines. And so every month from the time I was 13 till I was almost, I guess, close to 30 years old, I collected every single Vogue magazine and I had them in bookshelves. And so I stopped buying the Vogue magazine. I was so distraught over not being able to do it that I wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. So I never made any more clothes for myself. I never did anything for about 15 years.
You still have those magazines, though.
Yes, but you know what I did do? What? I ended up getting rid of a whole bunch of them because we kept moving them. And it was a huge collection, as you can imagine.
It's still really big.
So the big issues were always September, October, and then March and April. So those were like an inch or an inch and a half thick. And then the other ones were much smaller. Mm-hmm. But every time I moved, I had to get friends and family, right, to move those magazines, right? And they're really heavy and they take up a huge amount of space. So they took up a whole wall. So then I think on one of the moves from one house to another house, and I wasn't doing fashion anymore, I only kept the 4 editions per year. So now from 1978 or 79, I have the September, October, and the March and April. But I threw away all of the other ones. So I have those collections. And then after I came back into fashion, 10 or 11 years ago, I was intending on buying them again. But the whole world has changed, right? And they don't really do them anymore. So those Vogue books are not that big anymore, and they don't really have much in them, and they're not as current as they used to be because Now, once a designer does a fashion show, the very next day, all of those pictures are publicized on the internet or wherever. And what we had to do back then is that they would do the fashion shows, and then those pictures were taken, I guess, but the designers wouldn't allow them to release them until the season came. So if they were doing if they were doing a spring summer fashion shows in September, those photos were taken, but they weren't actually released until the March April editions. So even the photographers held on to them, so nobody besides the designers and those that went to the show had access to the images until the season in which they were coming out. So that's why when we were using those magazines, or sometimes we were getting these fancy ones from Italy, we would get a little bit of a head start. So that's why some of those companies can do what they do now, is because once they go down the runway, those designers are putting their clothes out in the runway, and the stores aren't even going to get them till September and October. So they're showing them in September and October, and the stores aren't going to get them till April. They used to keep it all hidden, but now once they go down the runway in September, October, those fashions are then seen in the stores like immediately, like 2 and 3 weeks later, even before the manufacturer is distributing them through their natural outlet. So I think it's changing. I'm not exactly sure if designers go to market sooner, but they move those fashions from when they're doing those shows in September, October, right onto the movie stars or right onto the models, right onto the street the next day. But in the old days, you waited. You didn't know what was happening until like 6 months later. So we would take those, and then as soon as we could get them, and try and get those designs for when we had the La Movida out into the marketplace as the big designers were bringing theirs out. So if you saw something by Romeo Gigli in the store, La Movida would have a copy of or inspired by a Romeo Gigli in the shops at the same time. So I didn't do anything for a long time, and I was in banking, and it made me totally crazy, and I didn't sew, and I didn't do anything, and then finally I just went absolutely nuts, and I had to quit my job at the bank. And that was looked upon by everybody, even my creative friends, as a really crazy thing to do, because I was making very, very good money, and it was a very prestigious job, and it was really good and satisfying. But luckily my husband, who's lovely, said, "You're so unhappy at this job and you don't like it." And it was literally making me sick. And I would do everything to get into it. It was a job that I worked at home. So I would get up and put a suit on in the morning and put my shoes on and do my hair. And then I would go and sit at my desk. And I literally would sit at my desk for like 6 hours. And then I would try and do it. And then I started to get, panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And I hired a business coach to help me do things. And I had sticky notes. But I just was so not in keeping with where I needed to be in my world. And then I was thinking about my girls, because I had 2 kids at the time, and I was thinking, this is not what I want to show them. I don't want to show them that this is where your life is, and that I'm 45 at the time, like this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to live your dreams and be your best self and be healthy and happy. And I thought, I guess it was my midlife crisis. I'm like, I have to do what I have to do. So I quit my job and tried to figure out what to do next. And I considered going back to school to get my fine arts degree to be a teacher, but that was going to take me about 2 years, which might have been a smarter idea. And I thought, I don't know if I want to wait 2 years and go back to school and not have any income for 2 years. So I bought a franchise for a fine arts studio to teach kids fine arts, because I did have my background from Emily Carr, and I was a really good artist, and I love kids. And after working in the mortgage broker business, I did not want to speak to another adult ever again. So I knew that my heart was with the kids. I loved my kids, and I loved everybody else's kids, and I would have had 12 kids if I could have, but I couldn't afford to. Not that I couldn't, but I couldn't afford to. So I thought, I want to do something with kids. And so I went and bought a fine arts franchise. And for 3 years, I taught painting and drawing and three-dimensional crafting, design, or whatever, for kids, and I absolutely loved it. And it was absolutely the most fantastic job I'd ever had, and I loved it, loved it, loved it. It was really sweet. My husband at the time had been laid off from the job that he had, and so when we were setting up the new studio, he had 6 months off, not purposely, but he did. Anyways, he helped me build the studio, he helped me do all the planning, and then he also took all the training for the courses. And so over the 3 years that we had it, myself and my husband Dave taught art to kids, and it was like fantastic. We both were totally thrilled. The only thing that wasn't thrilling is that I had a 5-year background in fine arts and history, and he's just a super creative guy. And then we did the training together, and then we would teach classes, and all of the kids loved him more than they loved me. And his classes would fill up with 10 or 12 kids, and mine would just have the regular amount, and he would be like, nah, 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 nah. And he was like only an okay painter, but all of the kids, they didn't, I guess, have an opportunity to have a male teacher very often, and they were just adored him. And so he got all of his classes filled. So he was always very pleased that his painting classes were way more successful than mine were. Anyways, we did that for about 3 years. And I'll say this gently, the arrangement with the franchisor and me, the franchisee, did not work out very well. And there was a slight dispute, and we left that company very quickly. I learned while I was there how to teach kids, how to run kids programs, how to do things with the kids, but I could no longer stay there. So on the day that we left that company, I enrolled in a how to build a small business course at BC Small Business. And like the day that we left, we ended up leaving at like midnight in the middle of the night. And the very next day, I was enrolled at the Start Your Own Business or Small Business Entrepreneur course that was 5 days, for 5 days, 8 hours a day. And so I took that and decided that I was going to open my own business. And I wasn't exactly sure what it was going to be, but through that week, we were having lots of legal wranglings with the lawyer and the old company, and it came to my understanding that I would not be able to open a business that was a fine arts business. And so through a suggestion of a friend, said, well, why don't you teach sewing? Because that's really your best thing. And nobody in this city teaches kids how to sew it. Some parents and some people do it in their basement, but there was no program set up for sewing. So she's like, you can teach kids, you know how to run programs, and you know how to sew, and you know how to pattern draft, so you have a passion for it. So why don't you do that? So over that week, that's what was decided. And then I took almost a year to build the program that we were going to do here. So that was in, I believe it was sort of like September, all of that happened. And then from September until March, we worked on patterns and what it was going to look like and workbooks and researched and try and figure out how to do. And then we researched to try and find a place to go. And I believe we found La Movida, this spot, in like May. And then we got the shop, and the shop was in terrible condition. It was an old doctor's office, and it still had like the doctor's chairs and the tables and the heart rate monitors all over. And it had been decorated in like 1972, and the doctor had moved out like 3 years before, so the space had been empty. And so it was a cold, awful, dark, empty, yicky space. And actually it was so ugly and terrible that I remember crying and lying in my bed at night and going, it's so ugly and it's so terrible, and I have this idea for this really cute sewing shop, and the kids aren't gonna come, and it's ugly. And my husband's like, we can do anything, we can make it look great, we can make it look pretty. I trust you, and I trust our vision. And so between the two of us, we were able to, in the months of, it took a long time because we did the two of us almost everything. So it was March, April, May, June, and then July. And then we were pretty much finished. And in August, we were ready to open, but we didn't have any students. So we went to farmers market. So we did the Kitsilano Farmers Market, and I think we did the Main Street Farmers Market. And we set up a tent, and we had 2 machines and some fabric. And initially we were going to do a lot of silk screening because my husband Dave was going to work in the business with us. And we thought that we would do some silk screening as sort of like a foray between textiles and printmaking. And so at those farmers markets, we had set up a printmaking situation where we could print off t-shirts. And so we were printing off La Movida t-shirts and then printing off other things that other people had making. And then we were showing sewing and sewing classes and letting people sit down and actually sew things. I can't even remember what they were sewing, little bags or little things, and so they could come and sew. And we did all of our marketing and advertising there. And then come September, we started our very first classes and birthday parties. And so at the farmers market, we also advertised our birthday parties. And so I think the first couple of things we did were birthday parties. And my husband Dave was my was my co-teacher at the time, and everything was tested out on my girls. So my girls were 8 and I guess 11 at the time. So all of the projects that we were going to do, they had to make them all first. And so we have some of the originals. And so that's how they learned how to sew and design. So it was a real family thing. So we were sitting around, me trying to write out sort of curriculum and the girls making all the projects, and then test running birthday parties with their friends. And so have all their friends out, and then doing some birthday parties here. And then eventually we got some classes. But the classes were really sweet in the beginning because there was like 2 kids in one class and 3 kids in another class. It didn't take us very long. The following September, we had a registration of 65 students. So it didn't take too long. It was mostly word of mouth, and we had a lot of, all of our kids were like 8 and 10 and 11. So we had lots of family friends spread the news. And I also made lawn signs and made every student that was a supporting student and all of my family put signs on their lawn that said, "Come sew at La Movida." So there were lawn signs. We learned really quickly you can't put them on public spaces. So yeah, no public spaces.
Did you do adult classes at this time? When did you start those?
We did not do any adult classes until I hired my first sewing person, because I was not interested in anything to do with adults.
So the 65 was just kids?
Was just kids. I don't think we did anything in the adult realm until the following year. Also, and also some of the reasons for that is that there just wasn't enough of me to go around, and I didn't want to stay so late. So I had an 8 and an 11-year-old, and our classes were running till 7 o'clock at night, so I wasn't coming home till 7:30 or 8 anyways, and we had Saturday classes. And so for me, and then birthday parties, so for me to run adult classes would have meant that I was going to have to stay late at night, more nights a week, and I just wasn't really interested in doing it. So I think after we hired our first employee, which would have been about a year later, we hired them specifically to want to be able to do the adults. And then we started off, I think, right away with that instructor teaching adults. And I think that that is what they wanted to do. It was a while before we were able to find any instructors that had the ability to teach and who wanted to teach kids, because instructors or sewers were coming out of design school or doing their sewing thing and just didn't have any experience with the kids. And so they didn't want it, and I didn't really want to give it away. So we hired someone. And still to this day, I do some of the adult classes, and I did do adult classes. And after a while, I became more comfortable teaching them, realizing that fashion design students or sewers who wanted to learn how to sew were much different than the folks that I was trying to approve mortgages for. So they were more of my tribe than I was willing to anticipate. But I still prefer to teach the kids. And the reason for that is that when you teach a kid to sew, they are just so thrilled with the process. Like, look, I sewed a line of stitching, or look, I sewed this up. And then when they make something, they are just absolutely thrilled. Like, they put it on and they walk around and they dance around, and they're just so proud that they made this thing and that they get to tell people that they made it. Adults, when they make something, while they're making it, they are way more uptight about doing it right, getting it straight. They get very embarrassed or nervous about making mistakes, right? They self-admonish, that the word, like they give themselves a lot of grief when they make mistakes. They'll say, "Oh, I'm so stupid," or "I'm this," and I'm always like, I have to give them way more encouragement. Like, "No, that's totally okay. This is all good for a new learner, and that's totally fine." And they give themselves a bit of a hard time, and they also will get frustrated and disappointed with themselves. So the road for many new sewers adult sewers is quite bumpy, and they give themselves a really hard time. And I wish that they wouldn't. I wish that they could come to it with the joy that a kid has, right? Like, you're learning something new and mistakes happen and it's all good. And sometimes you'll get some adults like that, but it's kind of funny. Even when they're doing that, they're doing it with this like intentional mantra that they're like, "I know I can make mistakes. It's okay that I make mistakes." But they're really talking themselves through it, so they get quite uptight. So that is not as much fun, and they're quite serious about it. And then when they finish making the garment, the problem is that then they're judging their success on how good the garment looks on them. And so then there's nothing that you can break through or say to someone who doesn't like the way something looks on them. And they also will often give themselves a hard time, like, oh, it doesn't look good on me because, oh, my figure's not good, or my face is no good, or I didn't sew it well enough, or it didn't look, so they give themselves lots of grief about why it didn't look good. And I'm just like, you made one thing. Like, I've made 10,000 pairs of pants, and I've made 50 jackets in the last couple of years. Like, some work, some don't. Some sewing skills are good. And sometimes even when I think it's the best, this happens all the time. I think it's going to look good on me, and then I put it on, it still looks poopy. And so I give it away, or it goes in the trash, or I cut it up, or I make it into something else. But I'm always trying to express to adults, it's like, unless you know that that style is going to look really good on you, it's hard to know. Like, when we go shopping in a shop, you might take 10 things into the changing room and try them all on, and maybe one thing will fit. Or look good, or the way that you want them to look. And that's exactly the same as when you make clothes. You just can't, the fit doesn't always turn out right the first time, and then sometimes you don't even like the garment. And the part that really makes me feel uncomfortable with that sometimes is that they often blame me. Like, somehow that's my problem. Like, oh, well, you didn't make the pattern right, or this isn't a good pattern, or this isn't a good fitting pair of pants, or whatever. And I'm just like, I just made it to fit you. I just sized it to fit you. You picked the fabric. You did. But anyways, so then they give it back to me, and then I'm not quite always sure how to respond to their unhappiness. And so then I'm using lots of language like, it's a process, and you're learning how to sew, and the more you sew, the better you'll do. But so teaching adults is definitely one of the more challenging aspects. And one of the other funny things about teaching adults is, like, there isn't enough time in the day for me to sew and make all the things that I want to make. I am inspired by fabric. I'm inspired by fashion. I'm inspired by what somebody else makes. So, like, every day I probably at any time can list off like 20 things I want to make. And then adults will come in and go like, I don't know what I want to make. I've made a pair of pants, and I've made a shirt and a jacket, and now I don't know. And I'm like, there's only so much of your body, right? There's only jackets, shirts, and pants. As women, we get skirts, but that's it. There's pretty much like 4 major pieces. You have to work within that realm. It is not an unlimited amount of something. So if you've made a pair of pants, then you've made 1 pair of pants. You got 50 more to make in your life. So we started off on one side of the studio, and we had the front studio, but of course we have very few students. So we had the front studio. The very front table that is there now was never used as a sewing or cutting table. Initially, it was just for display. So we had always had display set up on it. We used the main table that was there for cutting, 2 tables in the sewing room that we had sewing machines on, and then through the swinging doors in the back, which is now turned into our photo studio, and then my office sometimes, was another classroom. And so there was cut and sew tables in there. And then if you've been to the studio, where the main sort of area or reception area is in the back, was actually going to be the screen printing studio. And so back there was a big, huge industrial sink. And then there was another work cutting table. And so over the years, it transformed. We stopped doing silk screening and silk printing because it just wasn't popular. The sewing classes were really popular, so eventually it turned into a full sewing studio, and we sold off all the silk screening and silk printing and moved away from that and just did sewing classes. And so that was a classroom, and so that was a small classroom, and I started to do my design students back there. So the other instructors were running adult classes up front, and I was doing design classes in the back room. So there was usually only 2 or 3 of us. And so there was a small cutting table and then some sewing machines. And and so we run those. And then when certain times became popular, we ran the 2 on either side. So there was no sort of office or anything. But also we had very few fabrics. Like when we started, I had 1 bookshelf and it was half full. And so that was it. So now there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. There's 23 bookshelves plus all of the fabric that you can see behind me, plus, and plus. So, but we only had 1, so we had a little bit more room for students. So we were here for 2 years, I guess, or just under 2 years. And it was always my intention to be a franchise. I had come from a franchise background with the other company, and I had seen other franchises. So the idea was that we would set the studio up as a franchise. So lots of the things and the reasons and the way that we did things were all set up so that someone else could teach it. So we had a registration system, a curriculum system, a teaching system. We had standards of practice. We had all of the tables and chairs all custom made and built so that when we open another franchise up, all of those things could be repeated. So just at about 2-year mark, we decided, okay, we're going to do our franchise thing. We had enough students. The second year, our registrations went up and we were tickety-booing along. And so we decided that we were going to open another one up. So we searched everywhere, high and low, for a second studio. And we looked in East Van, and we looked in Burnaby, and we looked in Richmond, and we looked in North Van, and we looked in West Van. And at the time, I had about 5 or 6 students here enrolled from West Van. And so I got some feedback from those students that, you know, this would be a really good area to try and open up. And both of my kids went to school on the North Shore because they were going to a school for kids with dyslexia. So we were taking them, we lived in Kitsilano at the time, we were taking them over to the North Shore all the time to take them to school. So we thought, okay, well, that would work out well if we had a studio in the North Shore because my kids are already over there. I'm back and forth all the time. So we decided to open a shop, and it ended up being in West Van, which was a little bit more west than we wanted to go, but we were able to find this most amazing space. And it overlooked the water and UBC, and it was beautiful. It had windows and it was gorgeous. So we spent about 6 months renovating that property and spent a lot of money renovating it because it had been an apartment and we were turning it into a commercial space. We spent a lot of money, but anyways, and fixed it all up and painted it and built all the tables and built everything and hired the most lovely sewing instructor who was going to be our studio head. She was able to teach and also work the studio in that way. And we left her over there. I went over like 3 times a week, but left her over there for a year to build a studio over on the North Shore. And we never got any traction. It was the most disappointing adventure I think that I had ever had, because we bought new computers and sound systems and fabrics and built tables and did marketing and advertising, and we knew so many students already had 6 students. Like I thought right off the hop, I've got 6 students registered, and when we started here we had none, and we'd been marketing the studio here in Vancouver for 6 months while we waited for that one to go. And I had all these connections to families on the North Shore because my kids were going to school over there, and could not get, and we did demographics. Like we did like how many elementary schools were in the area and how many kids were in the area and what was the family income in the neighborhood and like how many girls were in the neighborhood and like what other programs were running and what other things were successful, and did all of these things. And then we sent out all of these invites to very either famous or well-connected people or people I knew for free birthday parties. So we did like 13 free birthday parties over there for kids, and we really dialed them out at that time, like really made them special because we really wanted them to be great. So we got like my mother's silver tea service, and we served like the drinks out of the silver tea service, and we had teacups and we had tablecloths and we had like silver tea trays to put like sandwiches and stuff, and we bought cakes for everybody, got a free cake. So we were going to like the fanciest bakery, and if you came and had a birthday party for free, and we would bring the cake, and then and anyways, we did all of that and had all of these birthday parties, and nobody signed up for classes. And then the killer about it is that those students that were from the North Shore that were enrolled in my class, and I tried to enroll them over there, stopped coming altogether. And I never had any kids the entire time that I was on the North Shore. I never had any adults or any students from the North Shore come to the Kit studio, but they didn't go to the North Shore studio. It was very weird. So we ran it for a year, and we were not able to get any traction. Oh, we did so many things. We did in-school programs, free in-school programs at the schools to go in 3 different times after school and run sewing programs after school to try to do the marketing. And we anyways, so much that we did, and nobody wanted to come. And so it kind of crushed my dreams of being a franchise owner. I just thought that it would be so easy and super successful. And so we ended up subletting out the business to another company. And ironically, the woman that we sublet it to was doing a different business, but a similar business, and she lasted a year, and then she went out of business. And then we rented it to somebody else, a third person who was doing a similar kind of business, and they lasted about 2 years, and then they went bankrupt. So I don't know if it's the North Shore location or it was that physical location or what it was, but launching a new business in West Van seems like very, very difficult thing to do. So we then snuggled back into our studio here, and then about a year later after that, we took over the store that was beside us. So the store that was right beside us was empty the entire time that we had rented it out, and was actually our first choice. It was empty with both properties empty. It was our first choice, but the landlord didn't want us to take it because the second side was far more, I think, marketable as a nice space, because our space had that doctor's office in it. So we took the other side first, and so then we begged and pleaded, and my landlord is a very, very nice gentleman. And after we were here for, I guess, this store opened up 5 years, I think almost to the day of when we opened up the other one. And so we've now been on side 2 for 5 years. And lots of wranglings, because over the 10 years that we've been here, there's lots of different zoning and different things. So we weren't really allowed initially to run like a school, because you weren't allowed to run a school out of a retail store. So it was very difficult. But right now, zoning laws have changed and lots of things are different. So there's lots of businesses now that run like karate studios or Pilates studios or yoga studios out of retail stores, and learning centers and things like that. So like the Kumons and all that. So I guess over the years, because different businesses want to do that kind of thing out of retail, we are now able to run it as a sewing studio.
The other thing I wanted to get into was about the patterns, like your thought process on developing the patterns, the sizes, and kind of your experience, like learning how to do those.
Okay, well that one's pretty good. So when I had a La Movida originally, for the first, like the original company, when we started out, we had to do all the sewing ourselves. And so I did a massive amount of sewing. Like I was making like 10 pairs of leggings or tights, and like I could make 10 pair in an hour, and like ballerinas tops. So we were just like, so my sewing skills were pretty good, especially in production. I don't know whether if I made a wedding dress, I'd kind of have those kind of like specific skills, but those skills were really good. And so I was sewing, and then about 10 years later, the sewing kind of gets a little bit dull. And so it was the next thing that I wanted to do, was to be really good at pattern drafting. And so when I went to design school, I found that I was really, really good at it. And it's kind of interesting now I look back with kind of like a little bit of a neurodivergent brain. I didn't know that my brain sort of worked different than other people. But what I learned is that I can look at a three-dimensional object, and I can take that three-dimensional object and undo it in my brain and then lay it out flat. So when I was at La Movida, the first company, and we didn't really have pattern drafters, I would freehand cut out the garment and then sew it up. And then if it fit, then I would take it apart sometimes, or sometimes I would cut out 2 at one time, sew one up, and then see if it fit. And if it didn't fit, then alter the second one. But everything was backwards. So when I went to design school, right, you draw, you pattern draft, you make a muslin or a first draft, and then you make your final copy. So I was always doing it backwards. I would freehand cut out the garment, and then I would make a paper pattern out of it. After I made a paper pattern out of it, then we would make, I guess, a good sample, and then we would do the technical drawing, and then we would do the illustration if we needed an illustration. So completely backwards. And I even encourage my kids here sometimes, is that if that works for you, that works for you. Because for me, I don't see fashion design in drawings or technical flats at all. I don't see it from a photograph. The image comes up in my head, and it is a three-dimensional image. And so like if I saw clothes in a store, I encourage my students to go and turn them inside out or take pictures. But pretty much I can just look at a garment, unless it's very, very complicated, and have an idea of how it would come apart. So when we were starting here, I was looking for kids' patterns for clothes. And then I realized that you can't buy them. So all of the traditional 4 big companies, they make baby clothes or baby style kids clothes up until like size 10 or something. And then they make adult clothes that have adult fitting. But there was nothing in the tween market whatsoever. So I looked at a couple other companies, and there were some small companies like Kids Learn to Sew and something else. I can't remember. There's another one. It was in the States. And so we purchased their pattern packs, and they came in, and they were horrible. Like they were like doctor's office kind of things, like a tunic and then like a nightgown and like boxy shorts. And I was like, kids want high fashion or fashion. They don't want to make something that's super ugly, even on their first time out. Like why would you make ugly clothes? And there was another company in town that was sort of teaching. And one of the things that they would do is they would have the students bring in their own fabric, right? So they were using this pre-made pattern company, and then they would tell the kids to bring in their own fabric. So I was able to meet somebody from that program and realize like they're using these really, really ugly patterns that nobody would want to wear. And then the parents and the kids had no idea what fabric was suitable. So then they were making these really ugly patterns and these really ugly clothes out of these really ugly fabrics or leftover fabrics or something. And then the kids was coming home with this ugly thing. And I was like, no matter what, I don't want ugly, because I don't want to wear ugly. And the idea is, if it's beautiful or you love it or it's a style that you wear, a little sewing error here or a little sewing error is not that big a deal. I mean, I walked out a million times in something I wear where I'd have to like hold my hand over my shoulder, like, don't look at this bit here, because I didn't get the sleeve in right? Or I accidentally cut a hole here, that's why there's like a patch over here. But I was so proud because the garment was dynamic or interesting or was something. So I thought, I'm not doing that. So we thought like, well, what are we going to do? And then it was just like, well, I'm just going to take my pattern drafting skills and I'm just going to sit down and figure out how to do this. I'm going to figure out how to make a kid's pattern. We knew that we wanted to start the kids sewing at about the age of 8. From my previous experience, I knew that that's sort of like the tipping point for our kids at the right age, that they are tall enough to sit at the machine, have enough dexterity to start using scissors and pins and understand the idea of three-dimensional design. So my daughter's 8. I took her to the stores, all the fancy stores, and said, what would you want to wear? What would you want to buy? What would be your favorite thing? And we just picked out things, and then I would go home and then draw and design and draft those patterns. And for most kids, the patterns are really simple because they don't have much shape to their body anyways. They're kind of just like sticks or dolls or whatever. So the patterns didn't have to have darts, they didn't have to have curves on them. But what they needed is they needed a cute style, they needed a cute fabric, and they needed to fit because kids at that age are challenging to fit. And so that was one of the things too that we really took into consideration, was that an 8-year-old can be a whole gamut of sizes, right? Because they can be quite tiny at 8 and they can also be 5'8" at 8, like some really big kids, and they can be very, very skinny, or they can be very, very thick or athletic, right? So we get all shapes and sizes. So you can't just say, here's a size 8, because a size 8 is actually like a gamut of sizes. And I think perhaps that is why many of the big companies don't have clothes for that teenage body or that teen, because how do you size for them, and how does the medium or novice sewer size for them, right? Like if you're not an expert sewer, how do you buy a pattern and make it work for a 12-year-old? Because some 12-year-olds' figures are just miles apart. So we came up with really cute, pretty straightforward patterns, but what we had to be able to do in the class is make them taller or shorter or wider or smaller without saying that's a size 8 for a kid. And the patterns were quite simple. And then what I wanted to do was get the nicest fabric that we possibly could, because I sort of said, like, you can buy a pair of pajama pants at Old Navy for $8 and you can buy a pair of pajama pants at Aritzia for $65. So what's the difference? The shape is almost the same. It's just a little bit of cute styling, it's a little bit of good fit, and it's a little bit of really nice fabric, right? And kids are very, very tactile. They want it to feel really nice. So we got to get the nicest feeling fabric in, and we got to get some cool fabrics in that they'll like the colors of, and enough fabric too in different, so that the students have enough to make choices. Because that's the other thing that we were aware of when we were making these, is that as time has gone on, clothes for girls and boys have become very stereotyped, right? So all the girls' clothes are all pink or in that realm. All the boys' clothes are navy blue. And I know from my kids that they might still want something a little bit girly, but they're not a pink girl. And you might be a boy, and we don't get very many boy students, but you might be a boy, but blue may not be your favorite color. So we wanted to be able to put a whole gamut out there and say, you can wear yellow, and you can wear turquoise, and you can wear green, and you can have orange. So we wanted a really good scope of colors where we weren't just specifically that girly. Even though it looks like now, and not today, that my favorite color is pink, it's not true. And I actually, up until 5 years ago, almost wore very little or no pink, because I'm just not that girly. I've embraced the pink in me now. I am confident enough now actually to wear pink, But this feminist inside of me was like, I'm not going to wear pink because, you know, that's too girly. And so I didn't want to be girly. So now that I don't have to worry about that anymore, now I can wear pink and not feel less than. How's that?